George here. Today we're going to talk about Louis Pojman's response to relativism. Last time I talked about Ruth Benedict's version of relativism. Louis Pojman is going to give us some ideas. He's going to lay out the relativist argument and then illustrate, wait, here's where they're clearly wrong, or they don't make sense, or there's some sort of incoherence or illogic to this position of cultural relativism. Furthermore, Pojman is going to give us an alternative to cultural relativism. Louis Pojman starts off by giving us the relativist argument. First, he suggests that there's the diversity thesis. The diversity thesis. What is the diversity thesis? The diversity thesis says that there are so many different moralities around the world. So many different moralities exist. The second step of the argument is the dependency thesis. What is the dependency thesis? The dependency thesis is that one's morality depends on the society or culture that one was brought up in. Both of those together lead to the conclusion for relativists that there are no universal, absolute, objective moral standards. That was echoed especially by Ruth Benedict last time. There is no universal morality. Why not? Well, number one, the diversity thesis. Because there are so many diverse moralities around the world and at different times. Number two, the dependency thesis. Your morality depends on where you were brought up. Therefore, there can't be universal standards for morality. Louis Pojman does a sort of detour for a moment and takes us to subjectivism. What is subjectivism? Subjectivism is going to say that the basis of morality is based on the subject. One subject, yes? Morality is dependent on the individual, is based on the individual. Morality is in the eye of the beholder, the subjectivist would suggest. He gives an interesting example of subjectivist morality. Ted Bundy, infamous serial killer. He gives us the excerpt of some words by Ted Bundy as he's speaking in court. Ted Bundy says something along the lines of, why is it more wrong to kill a human than any other animal? Right? He's ultimately saying, listen, killing humans brings me pleasure, and I have to bring that pleasure forward, right? I hope that nobody is convinced by Ted Bundy's argument here, right? Ted Bundy is a serial killer. Well, my hunch at least. If you are convinced by his argument, that's fine. Pojman will try to illustrate why that's off. But my hunch is that might feel a little queasy for some of us. That, yeah, subjectivists would say, hey, what makes me happy is serial killing. Therefore, serial killing is okay according to my morality. Don't judge me for that, right? He also suggests and brings the example of Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler, of course, committed genocide. Why? Because Adolf Hitler thought that genocide against Jews was the right thing to do. That's Hitler's own subjective morality. However, and this is going to be essential and central to Pojman's whole idea here, Pojman gives us a definition of morality. He says that the aim of morality is to prevent the state of nature. The aim of morality is to prevent the state of nature. Yeah, morality is about us not merely being like animals and eating whoever comes our way when we're hungry. Thus, Pojman concludes, subjectivism is absurd, because what subjectivism actually does is lead to no morality at all. If morality is about preventing a state of nature, well, subjectivism ultimately leads to a state of nature where it's just each individual's morality and everybody else be damned. I will eat you if I wish to eat you. I will serial kill you if I wish to serial kill you. Pojman suggests that is clearly absurd. That is no morality at all. The very concept of morality is about living with others. in community. Now, what was Pojman's point about bringing up subjectivism? Well, we'll see in a moment, but I like this technique, this philosophical technique, this argumentative technique that Pojman uses. He says, wait, let's take a look over here for a second, please. Let's look at the ethics of a serial killer. Let's look at the ethics of a genocidal madman. And let's see if we could use those insights to talk about the wider notion of ethics and morality. So after dealing with that detour with subjective morality, which Pojman concludes is no morality at all, Pojman now brings back what he calls conventionalism, which is ultimately this conventional notion of cultural relativism, or this conventional relativism. Remember that the point at the conclusion of Benedict's essay is that tolerance is the order of the day. Tolerance is the order of the day. We shall tolerate other different moralities because even though we think it's wrong, even though we feel like it's wrong, it's probably just perfectly good in some other culture. Yeah. They just have the bad luck. This person just has the bad luck of being born in the wrong place at the wrong time, so to speak. That is ultimately what Pojman understands and grasps on from conventional relativism. However, Pojman sees a problem with tolerance, right? The point is, here's the problem ultimately, the philosophical problem. Why be tolerant? Why be tolerant? A couple of problems with tolerance. Number one, it seems like that sounds like a universal principle that people like Benedict are trying to push onto us. We should be tolerant. Why be tolerant? Why? Because I want to participate in Ruth Benedict's morality? It sounds like Ruth Benedict was trying to put forward a universal morality of tolerance. Isn't that self-contradictory to the cultural relativist claim that there are no universal, especially if we recall Ruth Benedict's point, that there are no universal moral truths? Yet she ends her essay by, it sounds like, giving us a universal truth. Be tolerant. A universal value. Be tolerant. A universal rule. A universal moral principle. Be tolerant. The question that Pojman asks is, why? Why be tolerant? Right? Another problem that you might come up with is how do you tolerate intolerant cultures? Aren't some cultures actually intolerant? Well, Pojman did raise the issue of Hitler in Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany under Hitler was a very intolerant culture. How shall Ruth Benedict address that? Oh, be tolerant of them. Oh, they're just born at the wrong place at the wrong time. That's their culture. Oh, those genocidal madmen. You only call them madmen. Is that really what we want to say to people like that? Pojman poses that question. Seems like not. Furthermore, what this really means is, according to Pojman, is that we cannot, I cannot, you cannot criticize other cultures. You can't criticize positions outside of your own culture. Again, not even intolerant cultures? What about those intolerant cultures? And there are places around the world, we bring up Nazi Germany, there are places around the world which, let's say, treat homosexuals in murderous ways. There are places around the world that treat women in what I would call brutal ways. Is Benedict and are the cultural relativists suggesting we can't criticize intolerant cultures? Not sure, right? There's another problem that Pojman poses for relativism, and that is the problem of reform. Think about reform. Think about a reformer who wants to change their own culture. According to Benedict, it seems, or the relativists, a reformer within some culture is therefore wrong. Because reformers, by definition, say our culture is wrong. Our culture is a bad culture. I'm thinking of Martin Luther King Jr., for example, as a reformer. He's saying, my culture in the American South in the 1960s, this is a bad culture. seems like Ruth Benedict and the cultural relativists have to acknowledge that reformers are therefore bad people, at least within their culture. That's an interesting problem because, yeah, I think many people suggest that Martin Luther King was a good person, just intuitively speaking, after all. There's another problem that Pojman poses, and that is the problem of subcultures. This is a grander problem for philosophical concerns that I have. What is a culture, after all? What is a culture? What defines what a culture is? I just brought up Martin Luther King. He was wrong in his American culture in the American South in the 1960s. But might Martin Luther King Jr. have been right in his subculture of blacks in the American South in the 1960s? Right? So why not talk about subcultures then? What is one culture? Why not address subcultures? Well, here's the philosophical problem with talking about subcultures. Why can't I make my own culture? Why can't Ted Bundy make his own culture, his own serial killer culture? Aren't there cultures of serial killers after all? And within their culture, they're okay. Or, like I said, why not just make my culture of one? Let's say there aren't a whole lot of serial killers, but I have a subculture all to myself. And therefore, I am good within my subculture of one. Am I to tolerate such subcultures? Well, it seems like Ruth Benedict and the cultural relativists are going to get in a bit of a bind here, according to Pojman. Thus, with the problem of subcultures especially, the big problem is that conventional relativism seems to collapse into subjectivism. And we remember what Pojman already said about subjectivism, right? Pojman said that subjectivism is no morality at all. So if subjectivism is no morality at all, and cultural relativism collapses into subjectivism by saying, hey, there's a subculture of one person, Ted Bundy's culture of serial killers, of one serial killer, then cultural relativism is absurd, according to Pojman. Cultural relativism is no morality at all, because it's the same as subjectivism, according to Pojman's argument and Pojman's line of thinking. But let's go back to the relativist argument Pojman asks us to do. Recall the first point, the first premise of the conventional relativist argument, the diversity thesis, that there are so many different values and so many different cultures around the world. Well, there are two problems with this. The first problem that Pojman suggests is perhaps it's not really true. Perhaps it's not really true. After all, doesn't every culture have a dictum against murderers? Against murdering innocent people? Doesn't every culture have values against liars? Doesn't every culture have values against bad parents? So his first suggestion is maybe it's not actually true, the diversity thesis, that everybody has completely different values. After all, those are three examples. Don't all cultures have rules against killing innocent people? Don't all cultures have rules against lying? Don't all cultures have rules against being bad parents? Furthermore, there's the second problem that's also problematic, and that is, so what? Yeah, you're right. Even if it were true that there are diverse cultures, what does that help? How does that help the argument? That's like saying there are serial killers. Does that mean anything about the morality of serial killers? Simply saying that there are serial killers? Of course not. Of course there are serial killers around the world. Of course there are terrible people. But does the existence of serial killers suggest that serial killers are therefore a diverse culture to be tolerated? Pojman certainly thinks not. Let's go so much for the diversity thesis. Yeah. So let's go to the dependency thesis, the second premise of the relativist argument. The dependency thesis, recall, suggests that all the morals we have are merely because of the culture that we grew up in. It depends. Our values depend on the culture that we were raised in. Now, Pojman suggests there's two versions of this dependency thesis. There's the weak version and the strong version. The weak version suggests, well, actually, there are similar values across cultures, like, for example, a dictum against killing innocent people, or a dictum against lying. However, different cultures are diverse in how they flesh out that dictum against killing innocent people. Or they're diverse in what they call an innocent person, right? That's the weak version of the diversity thesis, that, well, actually, all cultures do have a rule against killing innocent people. However, how they flesh out that rule, how that rule manifests in society, how they understand the rule in society is different across and around the world. The strong version of the dependency thesis suggests that actually everybody really does have very different principles around the world. Now, here's Pojman's point about bringing up the difference between the weak thesis and the strong thesis. The weak version isn't really relativism, he says. Right? The weak version isn't really relativism, because recall Ruth Benedict, there are no universals. There are no rules that apply everywhere to everyone across time. But the weak version admits that there are some rules. It's just how they play out or how they're manifest in different cultures. So really, Pojman's point is the relativist requires the strong version of the dependency thesis. That is, that there really are different versions of moral rules around the world, and they depend on our culture, our upbringing, our society. That's how my values were determined, because they depend upon the culture that I was raised in. Pojman's response to that is, wait a second, why can't we say that a culture is wrong? Well, one easy example of this that I like bringing up to prove this point is Nazi Germany. What's wrong with saying that culture was wrong? It is wrong to commit genocide against a group of people. What's wrong with that? Well, what would I base that on? And that is the key problem for a cultural relativist. What justification do you have for saying that the Nazi Germans were wrong? Pojman's response is, we could use critical reasoning. We could use rational thinking to determine which cultures are wrong, like the Nazi Germans. Furthermore, the dependency thesis requires, according to Pojman, what is called the indeterminacy of translation thesis. And what does the indeterminacy of translation thesis say? That we can't ever be clear on what some other culture means or what some other culture is saying. It's indeterminate what that really means in some other language, let's say. Pojman says, but that's obviously wrong. That's obviously wrong. People all over the world learn what other cultures mean. People all over the world learn multiple languages. Right? And so, because we do learn what other people say, we clearly do understand other cultures and what they mean. And so, why can't we use critical reasoning to say, wait a second, critical reasoning entails that Nazi Germans misunderstand morality. That is ultimately going to be Pojman's alternative to cultural relativism and relativism in general. What Pojman offers us is what he calls moral objectivism. Pojman's argument hinges on his definition of morality. And if we recall, his definition of morality was that morality is that which keeps us, humans, from devolving into a state of nature, into just being animals where you just eat whoever comes your way. And you're careful of being eaten yourself. Morality is that which prevents that state of nature. Furthermore, morality helps people flourish in a social community. Now, Pojman is going to take us into a little more of a divergence for a quick second, but it's very important. He's going to say, let us distinguish between absolutism on one hand and objectivism on the other hand. He says absolutism is the philosophical position that moral values are absolute and can never be overridden. Kant's philosophy, Immanuel Kant's philosophy, is an absolutist type of philosophy, such that you shall never lie. We'll get to that soon. However, Pojman is going to say objectivism is different. Objectivism is going to say that we can reason about the truth of morality. We can reason towards objective truths, towards objective understandings of morality. Recall, what is morality again? Helping people live together in a flourishing manner, right? And preventing a state of nature. And we could reason better and worse ways of preventing a state of nature and creating better social cohesion. Furthermore, Pojman is going to deny a core relativist tenet here, and that is, if we recall Ruth Benedict says there is no such thing as a universal human nature. There is no human nature. Pojman is going to deny that. He's going to say, wait a second. There is a such thing as human nature. There actually is a human nature. We all human beings, according to Pojman, have certain needs and desires that are universal. What are some examples of common human needs of all humans around the world? Well, number one, I have to eat. Number two, I need to drink water. Number three, I have to secure some kind of safety and security for myself, right? And so on and so forth. But those are just a couple, right? And so, with that in mind, can we objectively use reason to better meet those needs for all people in a social community? Pojman suggests, of course we can, right? Of course we can. Of course we could use reason to say this is a better way of securing, let's say, food for everybody. And by the way, that's a worse way of securing the basic human need for survival. Pojman has no problem saying that's good morality, that's bad morality. Some cultures do better than other cultures. If you deny these sorts of objective moral truths that we arrive at using reasoning, he calls that irrational. He calls Adolf Hitler irrational. He calls Ted Bundy irrational and unreasonable, right? Don't you? I do. So that part of the argument is a bit compelling for me. Pojman gives us 10 examples of moral truths that he thinks reason can teach us very quickly and easily, right? Do not kill innocent people. Do not cause unnecessary pain or suffering. Do not cheat or steal. Keep promises and honor your contracts. Do not deprive another person of his or her freedom. Do justice, treating equals equally and unequals unequally. Tell the truth. Help other people, at least when the cost is minimal to oneself. Reciprocate. When somebody does good to you, do good to them. And obey just laws. Now, you might not agree with all 10 of those, but I have a hunch that you agree with some of those, at least. And if you agree with some of those, that they are reasonable, that all cultures reasonably have them, right? Well, number one, that all cultures reasonably have them, but also number two, all cultures should have something like some of those that you agree with, right? Doesn't that disprove relativism? Well, according to Pojman, it certainly does. Now, Pojman does acknowledge something like the weak dependency thesis. He says there are these primary principles, and that list of 10 that we just read off, those are those primary principles, like do not kill innocent people. Yeah, he suggests that all reasonable cultures and all reasonable people believe in that moral truth. Do not kill innocent people. Here's the difference, however, and Pojman has to admit this, being reasonable himself. There are secondary principles. What does that mean? There are different ways that people realize, and different cultures might realize, right? Do not kill innocent people. What does that mean? Well, he gives us some examples of different cultures around the world that might not exactly call this a person, right? He brings it close to home, actually, here in America. He suggests everybody agrees with do not kill innocent people. However, people might disagree on what a person is. And he suggests that's the whole crux of the abortion debate. People disagree about what a person is. Is the fetus a person? Right? But nobody disagrees, whether you're pro-life or pro-choice, whether you support abortion rights or you don't support abortion rights. We all agree, both sides agree, do not kill innocent people. They just disagree on the secondary principle. How do we manifest this principle? What is a person? What is innocent? And so that is different ways that people disagree about secondary principles, but nobody reasonable disagrees with the primary principle. Do not kill innocent people. According to Pojman, morality and moral reasoning, the whole point of moral reasoning is to ameliorate suffering, resolve conflicts, and help human flourishing. That is what morality really is about, given his initial definition of morality, to prevent a state of nature and contribute to social cohesion. He ends his essay with this. He understands the appeal of moral relativism, right? Because there's so many moral relativists out there. He understands the appeal. So he says, so why do people like this? He gives us some ideas. And he says they're mistaken ideas, by the way. The first is that he says people believe in a false dichotomy between relativism on one hand and absolutism on the other hand. You're either an absolutist or a relativist. Well, Pojman says, no, there's a third way, an objectivist, a reasonable objectivist, where I can acknowledge that there might not be absolute moral truths, that sometimes they can be overridden, but for reasonable reasons, right? So there is a false dichotomy there because there is a third way, namely his own objectivism. Furthermore, the second reason that people like to believe in some position of moral relativism is that there's some false belief that if you're an objectivist, you must therefore be a realist. What does that mean? What is realism? Realism is the claim, is the position, is the belief that morality, moral truths really exist out there. Let's say in the mind of God, right? That there is some mind of God that can tell us the moral, there are really moral truths in the mind of God, right? Pojman doesn't say that moral truths are real in that way. Rather, he says, we reason them. If we reason them, we can get to moral truths. And they don't have to be real in that sort of religious sort of way. Now, if you are religious, God bless you, I think. But he's going to say, for those of us who aren't religious, you can still believe in morality. You don't need to believe that morals are in, let's say, the real ideas in God's mind, or something like that. Furthermore, and this I think is the strongest appeal to moral relativism, is the evils of ethnocentrism. Yeah, what do I mean by that? What does Pojman mean by that? The 20th century, for example, he brings up Adolf Hitler earlier. The 20th century witnessed terrible evils by people who basically said, I am right. My culture is right. My culture is better than that culture. And that culture is wrong. We've seen that claim made by terribly evil people. And of course, we don't want to make the same evil mistakes as others. And so Pojman says that helps people towards some sort of relativism. Since we've seen people make mistakes about morality, Pojman says people are therefore scared to make moral claims nowadays. But Pojman suggests, wait a second, it's easy to address that. Just call people like Adolf Hitler wrong. Right? Adolf Hitler was irrational. Adolf Hitler was insane. He wasn't using reason in the appropriate manner. He was using irrational or illogical or unreasonable thinking to come to his conclusions. Furthermore, there is, going back to this God analogy, there is this Dostoevskian version of the problem that seems to lead to relativism, and we call it Dostoevskian. Pojman does because it's in his famous novel, in Fyodor Dostoevsky's famous novel, The Brothers Karamazov. There's a section in that novel called The Grand Inquisitor. And in this debate, right, Dostoevsky writes, well, if there is no God, then everything is allowed. And that claim has haunted modern people since Dostoevsky wrote in the late 19th century. If there is no God that we believe in, then everything must be allowed. Pojman says, not so fast. We can use reason. We can still use reason to determine what should be allowed and what shouldn't be allowed. And that is the crux of the attack against moral relativism from Pojman's perspective. I think he does make a compelling argument, personally speaking. But I want to pay attention to one more last thing. And that is, what does Pojman's argument depend upon? It really depends upon, and as philosophical thinkers, as critical reasoners, you really have to see where Pojman's argument centers. And that is his definition of morality. Morality is about stopping the descent into a state of nature. Morality is about creating better social cohesion. If you disagree with that definition, then of course Pojman's whole argument falls apart. Pojman's argument depends on that central definition. So pay attention to that. I'll tell you that I like his definition of morality. Morality is about social cohesion. Morality is about not becoming animals or serial killers. If you subscribe to that definition of morality, then most of Pojman's attack against relativism should hold firm. But if you've got some other definition of morality that is different from Pojman's, well then Pojman's arguments might not hold as much weight for you. What might be some alternative notions or definitions or purposes of morality? Leave it up to you as a philosopher to figure it out, yeah? For now, bye.